Hey everybody, this is your Unit 1-2 test study guide review video. So let's get right into it so you can do an awesome job on your test. You can get this study guide as well as any of the notes, any of the warm-ups that you're missing, any of the things that you're missing from this unit. You can find all that on Plus Portals. You can just click on it. It's all right there for you. So let's dive right into it. Let's go through the terms first. All right, so the Byzantine Empire is the name for the other half of the Roman Empire that doesn't fall in the east, and it comes to be known as the Byzantine Empire. It tends to speak Greek, and we'll talk more about them as we go. Latria, Dulia, and Hyperdulia are all part of the Second Council of Nicaea, and we'll talk about those when we get to the Second Council of Nicaea a little later. The Pornocracy is 80 years of bad popes in the 900s, and we talked about the Cadaver Synod. That was one of your warm-ups. Nestorianism is it's taught by Nestorius. It's a heresy, and it is condemned at the Council of Ephesus. So, and we're back. Sorry, I just had to pause there to type in some more stuff. So it was condemned at the Council of Ephesus, and it taught that Jesus' natures of human and divine were two totally separate things, kind of like he had a split personality. Like sometimes he was human, and sometimes he was God, and he would go back and forth. Charlemagne was the first Holy Roman Emperor. He was a Frankish king who worked out a close deal with the Pope where he would protect Rome if the Rome crowned him as emperor. And he practiced some forced conversions to Christianity. Unfortunately, it was the first time in Christian history that had happened. Monophysitism is a heresy condemned at the Council of Chalcedon that taught that Jesus' divine nature overwhelmed and subsumed his human nature. So he didn't really have a human nature. They thought he was like a super Jesus where, he never would have, had to be potty trained, or he would have been the best at soccer. He was just always awesome. Never had to learn anything. So it didn't really acknowledge Jesus' humanity. Clovis was the first Frankish king to become a Christian, which sets up a long line of Frankish kings. Like later on we'll have Charlemagne, who and they play a big role in helping Christianity to maintain a strong presence in Western Europe. Muhammad is the founder of Islam. He's considered the greatest prophet by Muslims. And he was fascinated by Christians and Jews, but he looked at them and thought they didn't live out what they believed. The Crusades was a series of holy wars from holy wars and kind of pilgrimages from Western Europe to take back part of the Holy Land. We'll talk about a little bit more of them later. And also it was also to defend the Byzantine Empire from some of the Muslim empires who were attacking them. Jihad is a Muslim term for the interior struggle for holiness. In later years, some Muslims have used it as like a holy war in itself, but the primary meaning of it is a struggle for holiness that happens interiorly. Feudalism is the socioeconomic system of the Middle Ages where you have vassals and lords, and the person above you is the lord, and you pay them tribute, and the person under you is your vassal, and you take care of them. The more they take care of you, but you offer them protection, but they provide you with food and stuff like that. Almost everyone's a vassal, almost everyone's a peasant. You can read about that in notes number 3. Innocent III, you can read about him in notes number 2. He was one of the he's maybe the most powerful pope ever. He excommunicated the Fourth Crusade after they sacked Constantinople. Monasticism is a term for people living in monasteries. It became very important during the Dark Ages, and monasticism became the safe houses of culture and learning, while the rest of Western Europe was kind of falling apart and going back to subsistence farming. Gregory VII was a very powerful medieval pope in the 900s, 1000s, and he enforced clerical celibacy, meaning he made priests be celibate, all priests. Many of them were before that, but he enforced that as a discipline, which stays true till this day. He also solved the investiture controversy by excommunicating the Holy Roman Emperor, who then groveled in the snow trying to get his position back. So then after that, he got to appoint the bishops, because the investiture controversy was over who got to choose bishops. Was it the emperor or the king, or was it the bishop? And that was solved by Gregory VII, more or less. It's also called lay investiture, because it would be like a lay person investing a bishop if it was the king or the emperor. The Holy Roman Empire is a assembly of feudal kingdoms or feudal states that all voted on an emperor. That wasn't really a country. It was kind of a league or an alliance. The Great Eastern Schism is the split between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church that happened in the middle of the 11th century. when the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope's representative excommunicated each other. The Great Western Schism was a period of schism in the Catholic Western Church when we tried to bring the Pope back from Avignon to Rome, but the Avignon Pope didn't step down, and so anyway, then we had a schism for a while. The Papal States was a section of land in central Italy and a few other places that was donated by the Frankish king Pepin. He was in between Clovis and Charlemagne. And he donated this to the Pope, and to this day the Pope still has some land in Italy, although it's very small. We just call it the Vatican today. But it was the land that the Pope was like the king of. The Great Western Schism we talked about. Theotokos we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about Ephesus. The Catholic Church is the term for the Western Latin Church after the Great Eastern Schism. The Orthodox Church is the term for the Eastern, mostly Greek-speaking church after the Great Eastern Schisms. That's like in the Byzantine. Iconoclasm we'll talk about later when we talk about Second Nicaea. Christendom is the term for all the Christian lands of Europe. And in Europe at that time, there was still this sense that even though they were all broken into their little kingdoms, it was still all Christendom. So even if you were a Western Christian or you were an Eastern Christian, you still thought of yourselves as part of Christendom. The mendicant orders, the most famous ones were Francis and Dominic, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. They were the begging orders, meaning they didn't live in monasteries. They went out and begged and then gave money to the poor, and they preached and tried to spread the gospel that way. They were much more active, much less contemplative than the monastic orders that stayed in monasteries and so forth. In the Avignon papacy, we talked about a little bit already when there were 7 popes that living in Avignon, which was technically a papal state, but was really in France. You can read about that in notes number 5. Monasteries were super important during the Dark Ages because they were safe houses of learning and culture. While nobody else was learning or really writing music or doing any of that, it was still happening in the monasteries, and they evangelized the barbarian world when the Goths and the Visigoths and the Franks and the Ostrogoths all came through and took over. Major contributing factors to the decline of the Western Roman Empire, all these things in notes 1, especially there was no law of succession and just political corruption and assassinations and political discord, all that sort of thing. And then the barbarian invasions just got more and more successful. And some people think partly it was a spoiled, lazy population, but that's up for debate. What factors contributed to the eventual split between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church? Definitely a lot of cultural tension building between the Latin West, which was barbarian, and the Greek, more like old kind of Roman philosophical thinking, and mostly Greek-speaking East. Different languages, different just understandings and philosophical ways of thinking about the world. That gets into question number 4. How were barbarian Christians of the Dark Ages different from Roman Christians of the early church? They were less educated, and that would also be the same as with the Byzantines. They were less educated than Byzantines. They didn't have the same laws and philosophy as the people in the East. Also, Roman Christians in the Roman Empire were pretty tolerant. Romans were pretty tolerant because they were used to this big cosmopolitan society where people traveling all over the place. They were used to seeing people that weren't like them and tolerating them, whereas the barbarian Christians were much more tribal and sectarian and more, kept to themselves. Oh, I skipped some of these. So also the councils of Chalcedon and Second Nicaea, a lot of times the sides, it was more Eastern people versus more Western people, so that definitely built tension. The Byzantines failed to protect Rome during the Dark Ages, and so Rome turned to the Franks, and it culminated in the year 800 when the Pope crowned Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor, and that really upset the Byzantines. The 5 pillars of Islam, this is in notes 3. 1, faith in Allah. Prayer 5 times a day, fasting during the month of Ramadan from sunup to sundown, almsgiving, they give 2.5% of their income away, and a pilgrimage to Mecca at one point during their life. What positive impact did the Muslim pressure on Europe provide for Christians? The main thing is that it gave them unity. It gave them that sense of Christendom. So, and the other thing is it re-exposed them to a lot of Greek literature, such as like Aristotle specifically, will be really important. What changes were made in the practice of the sacrament of baptism during the Dark Ages? The main thing was that infant baptism, which had always been practiced, but it became like the normal way that people became baptized was mostly as infants, whereas before that it was not always the norm. changes in the practice of reconciliation and penance. So for the first time, it could be done privately. You can thank the Irish monks for that rather than in public. It was for any sin, not just big sins, and it could be performed by a priest rather than by a bishop. The Inquisition, this is all out of Notes 5. It was supposed to bring heretics back to the faith and have them repent, but in some places it becomes very violent and very coercive, specifically in Spain. Excuse me. The purpose of the Crusades was to defend the Byzantines and take back the Holy Land from the Muslims. How did they start? The Byzantine emperor asked the Pope for help in defending against the Seljuk Turks, who were a Muslim group, and the Pope called for a crusade. They were not very successful. The first crusade was a little bit successful. It conquered Jerusalem and established several other Christian kingdoms, but overall they were not successful at all and drained a lot of Europe's resources. The major blunders were at the end of the First Crusade. They massacred a bunch of Jews and Muslims. Also, the Fourth Crusade they never even got to the Holy Land. They sacked 2 Christian cities, Zara, and even a bigger deal was Constantinople, because it was the capital of the Byzantines, the people they were supposed to be helping out and defending, and it kind of cemented the whole Eastern Schism thing. So the Orthodox weren't going to be open to reconciliation after that. Also, they didn't the land that they did reconquer from the Muslims. They didn't give it back to the Byzantines. They just established their own kingdoms there. So it'd be like somebody, I go beat up the bully that stole your lunch money, and instead of giving you your lunch money back, I just keep it. That's kind of what happened. All right, the major aspects of the councils of Ephesus, Chalcedon, and Second Nicaea. You're going to have to write an essay about one of these, but I'm not going to tell you which one. What was the main issue or crisis? What was the outcome? So at Ephesus, the main crisis was Mary. And really, because she's the key to kind of understanding Jesus' human nature. So the different sides, there was one side that said Mary was the mother of God, the God bearer, the Theotokos. And the other side said, well, you can't really call her the mother of God. She's just the mother of Christ. She's the Christ bearer. And that was a guy named Nestorius, and his followers were called the Nestorians. At this council, they decided, no, Mary is Theotokos. Jesus is just one person. He's not 2 persons. Yes, he has a human and a divine side, but he's really just one person. So they published letters condemning Nestorius and sent that out to the church. Chalcedon followed up Nicaea very quickly because people were confused about Jesus' 2 natures. They're like, all right, so if he's one person but 2 natures, the divine side would kind of take over the human side. That's what a lot of people, especially in the East, thought. So there was this heresy, monophysitism, or the Monophysites were the people who held that, thought that Jesus' divine nature really overwhelmed and took over his human nature. Pope Leo the Great wrote a very famous document called his Tome, Leo's Tome, and we read part of that as a warm-up one day. And it was so convincing that it convinced everyone at the council and that Jesus really was true God and true man. It reaffirmed Jesus's humanity, that he's 100% human, 100% God. So monophysitism was condemned, which caused the Coptic Church, which again was in the East, to split off. So that was the first church schism we have. And again, we talked about how the tension between East and West builds during this council, and even more so during the Second Council of Nicaea, which was about icons and religious imagery. The iconoclasts, which tended to be more Eastern Byzantine people, a lot of them saw icons as idolatry. Iconoclast means image smashers. And then the people in the West, they were like, nah, it's fine. They call those the iconophiles or the image lovers, and they were more Western Christians. And they just saw the icons as reminders that helped us to worship God. So the resolution is that icons are fine, and here's why. We worship God. The Latin word for worship is latria, and we only worship God. We don't worship anything else. But we do have respect, Latin word is dulia, for holy people and objects. We respect them because they lead us to God. They remind us of God. And then hyperdulia is a special respect we have for the Blessed Mother, because she was the greatest saint and the closest to Jesus, and she had a unique relationship with the Trinity. So that's why we have that special respect for Mary. Okay, this will be one of your essays too. You need to know about all these saints, but you need to pick one of them to know about in a little more detail. So decide for your test which one you're going to know most about. Okay, so I'm going to pause it there, and then we'll do a part 2 of this video. All right.